World of RPGs, episode 24, Brazil, part 1 of 2. Welcome to the World of RPGs, a podcast in which we travel around the globe and learn about the local role-playing game scenes. I'm your host, Mo Bartz, and in episode 24, we are going to Brazil. And this time we're doing it a bit different because I have a co-host. Hello.
Hi, Mo.
Hi there. So can you introduce yourself shortly for our listeners?
Sure. My name is Stefanie Grade. I'm currently residing in Berlin, so we're not in the same time zone, but we've known each other for quite a while. And I guess this is the first time we're doing a podcast together.
Yes. And how did you get into role-playing games, if I may ask?
I think my first contact was, as most people have had in Germany, with Das Schwarze Auge. So I remember seeing it in stores. The boxes were sold with other games as well. And I remember being fascinated by the artwork. And I think the first time I actually played was by myself, as one may do. It was a choose your own adventure book. I think it was by Packard, probably, as was usual by the time. I got it from the local library because I was fascinated with the whole concept of rolling dice and creating your own world. And this was the low key version in the local library. So they didn't have the Schwarze Auge as a box that you could pick up. So I did my own adventures. And I remember seeing the Dungeons and Dragons TV series back then on TV. And I remember copying the characters and then writing my own little adventures. And I think I may have mentioned it to a friend of mine in school, namely you. So we've known each other since 1992. And I don't actually recall when we started playing RPGs, but I think it might have been 1993. So somewhere around 8th grade, because first we were all very awkward and didn't disclose our fascination with fantasy and science fiction. But I think we started in 8th grade. And ever since, we've been together.
Now, the big question is, of course, you said you started with Das Schwarze Auge. That's a German game. So why am I talking to you now for the Brazil episode?
Because I'm actually half Brazilian. So I was born in Brazil. I came to Germany when I was 4 years old. My mother is Brazilian. She is a colonist, as they call themselves, in the south of Brazil. So she has German roots. My ancestors moved to Brazil from Germany in the 1800s, so somewhere around 1840s. There was a huge famine in Germany, and a lot of Germans were literally asked by the Brazilian king then to come to Brazil and act as farmers in the south of Brazil. And there was a huge population of German descendants in the very south of Brazil. This is why I'm fair-skinned. And if I tell people that I wasn't born in Germany, they ask me, okay, are you Scandinavian? Are you Polish or somewhere from the northern regions of Europe? And I say, no, I was born in Brazil. I always tell them, okay, you're probably familiar with Gisele Bündchen or other fair-skinned Brazilians. Mostly people associate darker skin tones with Brazil, but there is a large population that came from Central Europe and especially the southern regions of Germany. And my father is German, so when I was 4, he decided to go back to Germany and took us with him.
So what language would you speak in Brazil? Is that then German there or something else?
Actually, my grandmother never spoke the local language. As a lot of people that live in enclaves are prone, they conserve the language. My mother and my grandmother grew up speaking German, actually, a very interesting dialect of German. It's called the Rio Grandenser Hunsrückisch. So she grew up speaking German, but in Brazil, the main language is Portuguese, which a lot of people don't know. When I tell them I was born in Brazil, they ask me, do you speak Spanish? Because other Latin American countries have Spanish as their first language, but Brazil was colonized by the Portuguese. And ever since, the main language has been Portuguese.
In the Portugal episode, I asked them, because there are almost no games written in Portugal that are in Portuguese, they mostly do stuff in English. And I asked them, do you read any Brazilian games? Because there are much more games written in Brazil than in Portugal. And they said, no, it's awkward or it's strange to them. So, like, could you just read Portuguese and could you understand it when you hear it, or is it quite different?
It's different spoken. I think reading is easier. Of course, there are a few differences in the use of the more modern language because as we know from American English and British English, the languages got separated quite a while ago. And especially with new inventions, the terminology grows with the influences. So the Brazilian language has a lot of influence from the United States. And culturally, they are much more attached to the United States than to the European continent. So a lot of words that are new in Portuguese are derived from the English language. So I think that the continental Portuguese is a little bit different. But as with the American English, it is assumed that the Brazilian Portuguese is more closely related to the Portuguese that was originally spoken by the people that moved to Brazil, Portuguese colonists. And I think that the languages differ quite a lot in the sound. So oftentimes when I speak Brazilian Portuguese, people think that it's more melodic and has a different timbre than the Portuguese from Portugal. So the Portuguese in Portugal is much more in the back of the throat than the Brazilian Portuguese. And this is something that is quite difficult to imitate for me. So when I visited Portugal, I try to adapt the Portuguese, but it always sounds like I'm imitating them. So it doesn't sound naturally to me.
So you said they speak Portuguese in Brazil because there were Portuguese settlers, and then you also talked about German colonists there. So as I understand it right, the society there is quite mixed, isn't it?
So there were a lot of influences from different countries. We have a lot of people that came from Europe. So there are a lot of Italian descendants, but interestingly, there are also a lot of Japanese. So I think in Sao Paulo, there is the largest Japanese colony outside of Japan. This is quite interesting socially. So they have, instead of a Chinatown, they have a Japanese town in Sao Paulo. And of course, as with the history of the Americas, there were a lot of people that came as slaves to Brazil. So this is a very tragic part of the Brazilian history because with all labor-intensive works way back then, a lot of people were removed from the countries by force and brought to Brazil. And there is a huge part of the population that is descendant from those former slaves.
And I just checked on Wikipedia, so the population is like between 205 and 210 million people. Another thing I wanted to talk about, because, when you have role-playing games, you sometimes have magical issues or supernatural things, is religion in the country. So my first guess, being in a former Portuguese colony, would be that the majority is Catholic.
Yes, I think around 90% of Brazilians classify themselves as religious, and of those, the majority is Catholic. So it depends on the state that you're in. For the south and east, you are, the more Catholics probably are there. So the population in Brazil is mainly located on the coast. So this is something that is very interesting because the capital is not on the coast. Usually, if you think of Brazil, and the first city that comes to mind is Rio de Janeiro, and
most of the interviewees are from there.
It's probably the most famous city. So it's culturally influential due to the music that derived from Rio de Janeiro. So Carlos Jobim and the bossa came from this part of Brazil. And I think that most people associate Rio de Janeiro with Brazil and think that it's the capital, but actually it's Brasilia. And the idea behind the capital of Brazil, moving it towards the middle of the country, was to get the people to move into the country. So making an artificial city, making an artificial capital with a planned infrastructure, a very modern infrastructure in the times then in the 1960s. It was a city that was put it into the middle of the jungle in order to force people to move into the more rural areas, but they did not succeed. So population-wise, Brasilia is not as populated as the largest city. So the largest city is my hometown, as I could call it, where I was born, São Paulo. And the second largest city is Rio de Janeiro. And then you have smaller cities that by German standards are still metropolises. But I think that those are the most famous cities in Brazil.
Okay, and then you said these big populated areas are mostly Catholic.
Yes.
And if I'm not misunderstood, there are also like Protestant evangelicals in the country.
Exactly. So you have Lutheran church. So my family was raised Lutheran, which is very interesting because a lot of the German descendants are also Catholic coming from the area, but where my family came from, they were Lutherans. And you have Baptists as in America. And you also have what you would probably call Christian associated religions, like the Spiritists that have a huge influence in Brazil. They came from France and are more popular in Brazil than they are in France. There are also the religions in the northern parts of Brazil that have a lot of influence from the Afro-Brazilian community, and they could be compared to the Haitian Voodoo. So it's called the Candomblé, and they are also have Christian roots, but influences from the African religions and the African gods that are nowadays associated with the Christian saints.
Thank you. Bring this up because later when I talk to the authors of indie games, I usually ask them what's typically Brazilian in your games. And then they say, oh, I have some cultural elements and some elements about mysticism or faith, which are influenced by these Afro-Brazilian religions. And that's just how that can be connected.
I think it's also an influence of the indigenous part of Brazil. So you have to see that, of course, when Brazil was colonized, it wasn't empty. And there were, for instance, the Tupi-Guarani that have a very rich naturalistic religion. And as with many indigenous folks, they have the spirits of the nature in their fairy tales and also their culture. And those fairy tales are also told alongside of other European fairy tales. So I grew up with stories by the Brothers Grimm as a German child would, but also with fairy tales that were derived from those Brazilian indigenous folks. So there's a lot of folklore around Brazil that is closely associated to nature and also the spirits in the nature.
And that's very clearly a German siren in the background. Now, I would suggest we go into the first interviews. And so we begin, as always, with the team who did the actual play from the teaser last episode. And that is talking to two people at the same time, which is always difficult to edit, but I think it worked out.
Hi, I'm Nana La Rosa. I love cats and I love my friends. And I am broken in the head and I love editing. I really do. It's so relaxing for me, especially the part where I get to curse at my friends and they're not listening. They can't listen to me curse at them. So cathartic.
But how did you get started with RPGs? I hear them asking.
Oh, yeah. I was 13 years old, and someone that I don't remember who was it anymore introduced me to 3DT. It's a Brazilian RPG. It's an amazing game. So we started playing, and it was fun. And I was always into like theater, like my parents. So I started playing and never stopped. Never stopped. And I became a little bit one of those people that really get into character, but I learned to turn it off and not take that with me, which is very fun. I can cry in 1 second and then stop crying and then cry again at the snap of a finger. It's really fun. So yeah, that's kind of my relationship with RPG.
And which games do you play currently?
Oh my god. I play Tormenta 20, which is a Brazilian RPG. I'm planning a Monster Hearts campaign. Monster Hearts is amazing and I love it so much. Let's see, I'm playing a game that a friend of mine is creating right now, so we're playtesting it. It's an amazing game so far, and he allowed me to do some very crazy stuff. I play D&D, I play Kari Densetsu, I play currently, I'm playing Old Dragon, which is also amazing. I want to play Space Dragon so bad. And like, I think I'm gonna start playing Vampire the Masquerade again. We're setting up here in my town a group to play Vampire the Masquerade in person. So currently, there's that.
So Vampire the Masquerade is set in the real world. Where would you then play the game? I mean, would it be in the US or somewhere in Brazil?
In Brazil, in my hometown. I live in my hometown again now. And there are a few friends that I used to play Vampire the Masquerade with. And I went to Rio, lived there for a while. That's where I met Danny and other people. And then I came back to my hometown and they weren't playing anymore. And I was like, oh, that's sad. There's no one to play here anymore. Like now they're getting together and they want to play Vampire again. And I'm so excited because I love role playing and intrigue and the politics of Vampire. It's all fascinating to me. And I get to role play a lot.
Okay, speaking of Danny, you're also in the room, so can you introduce yourself and tell us how you got into role-playing games?
Okay, so first I will make my introduction saying, my name is Daniel. I am a professional game player. I am a game designer, and I am the game master in Falha Final, a podcast of the, I would say, heroic journey of Tormenta 20. So, first things first, what got me started in RPG was a friend of mine, a person that I met. It was like a group of people when I was almost a child. I was a preteen, in my preteens. And he started narrating this story and we played characters. I always loved fantasy. And this was my first contact with something akin to RPGs. However, when I got a little bit older and I discovered there were books, I went to a newsstand where there was this book. It was a very cool-looking book, small one, like a big magazine that was one of the supplements to 3D&T, the Brazilian RPG we were talking before. It was like a job book, and it was not only my first contact with 3D&T, but also my first contact with the setting of Arton, that is the setting of Tormenta 20. I think it's important for me to say that because nowadays I work for the company, the publisher, Jambô Editora, which publishes not only Tormenta 20, but also 3D&T, also is publishing in Brazil at the moment a translation of Daggerheart, and Fábula Última, one of the recently famous RPGs that is inspired by JRPGs, etc. And it's a pleasure and an honor for me to be working at this company that I always admire from afar.
And we're so proud of you.
Almost all the time, I forget that this happened because it's so surreal sometimes to believe my life. You know, when you say that, okay, I didn't expect my life to turn out like this. In my case, it was so far of the realm of possibility that I just said, okay, let's move on. That's my life now. To feeling I can say a little bit more about Tormenta 20 because it's important to say that Tormenta 20 is, if D&D is the most played RPG around the world, yes, it's the most relevant culturally, etc., etc., but I would say the main Brazilian system, because it is, although it's derived from D20 system, Tormenta 20 is a Brazilian system created by Brazilian authors, and it fills this role of a fantasy RPG classical in some aspects, it's something that makes us proud to be Brazilians and to have this system here.
So it sounds like your first contact was also with Brazilian games. So what is it like nowadays when you're in some city? Are there like role-playing shops where you can get them, or do you have to order it online? How is it on the ground?
It depends. Like in Rio, you can find more shops where you find books. Where I live, it's a smallish town. There are no RPG books to be bought here, but we can order online. A lot of like the Brazilian RPGs that we buy, we pre-order or buy them later. We also go to this fair that happens every year. It's called DOF. It is a very big fair where like indie game designers are selling their books, and you have a lot of options, and usually leave there with books and books and books of Brazilian RPGs, sometimes another language RPG, but like mainly Brazilian RPGs. We as a group, especially on our Twitch, we like to showcase Brazilian RPGs because it's important to showcase the scene, that we have quality products, that we have good things going here, and we have options. It's not just one thing. If you don't like fantasy, we have a game based on anime and manga. Oh, if you don't like that, we have more realistic ones. You can have like a cyberpunk thing. I have a game that I bought ages ago that is like heavily resource management after an apocalypse, and it's an amazing game. So yeah, we like to showcase Brazilian games because I think that they deserve to be seen.
Also, it's interesting to notice that in the 90s and the 2000s, we used to have more bookshops in Brazil. It was something more that existed in a bigger quantity. And with the passing of time, they started disappearing, and buying books at bookstores became more difficult, and the big ones closed down. So nowadays we buy it mostly online. However, it's interesting to notice that in the beginning, although there were RPGs produced here, we also had a lot of translation. So although one of the first that I read was for a Brazilian RPG, of course, my first like big collection was the D&D 3.5 books. When Nana was talking about the fair, the convention of game design, we have here in the city of Rio de Janeiro a big book fair, a huge book fair. I think it's one of the biggest in Latin America. I don't remember the official data. However, when I was very young and I was fascinated by RPGs, the funny thing about that was that I bought the 3.5 Player's Handbook, the 3.5 Game Master Handbook, but I didn't buy the Monster Handbook of the same edition. It was the 3.0 at the time. I didn't buy the correct one. So it worked, but it didn't work perfectly. It was not a perfect fit. But I've been loving RPGs. I do think that one important thing that we try to do in Falha Final as a group of people who create content is to showcase these games that are produced here, because although this does make people who will watch and listen to a podcast a little bit more limited, I think it's important to show that we also have these things, you know?
Yeah, and honestly, like as the person who listens to it the most because I edit the episodes and I have to listen to y'all talk multiple times. I know that I'm biased, but let's be biased here. Y'all are funny. Y'all are funny as heck. Y'all are really, really funny and good players. And my God, you're a good DM. It's incredible. And I'm not kidding. I'm not just like saying that because you're my friend. you are an amazing game master. And it's incredible what you can come up with and how you lead the story. You make it seem so easy. You make it seem like it's just another Tuesday. I know, sweetheart. I know that it's hard. I'm just saying that you make it look easy. You make it look like it's effortless.
Now we're already in the middle of another topic, but I wanted to ask that anyways. So how did you start with that actual play channel and what is it about?
I'll take the lead here. So it was, if I'm not mistaken, 2019, and the newest kind of, it's like the same way as D&D had the 5th edition and then had the 5th edition 2014. The latest edition of Tormenta was released around 2019. And I was having a lot of fun listening to a podcast called the Glass Cannon Podcast. It is an actual play podcast for Pathfinder. It was at the time the first edition, then they now have second edition, and they have also streams. I did enjoy their vibe. I think the biggest thing was their vibe, the way they played off each other. And I said, I want to do it. I love Tormenta. I love the setting. I love the idea of playing with my friends and recording. So I started a little thing. In my mind, is something like Nick Fury getting the Avengers. It was something like this. It was not as heroic, but it was more like I got to a friend and said, hey, why don't we play in an actual play podcast? It's going to be fun. It's fun. Do we know how to edit? No. Let's see what happens. So I first talked to Thiago Escobar, which is one of our members. He's also a game designer. Love you, Thiago. He was, of course, interested. We were all hyped because of this new edition of Tormenta. And then I talked to him and talked to Gil, which is another member of us, another game designer, great person. He's such a great person. I cannot, not only in height, because he's huge.
He's like over 7 feet.
He's like huge, and he has a huge heart. He also is an amazing artist. I have to say that about him. But we were talking and discussing this idea of recording the podcast, and we stumbled upon this guy who had a stream of another RPG published by Jambô Editora that is more inspired in Japan. It is still in the same setting as Tormenta, but more inspired not only in Japan, but like East Asia, I would say. And his channel was called Mr. Olhinho, which would translate as Mr. Little Eye. We came to know him, Wellington, but his nickname was Aaron. And I invited him. I said, hey, he's a nice guy. Let's invite him. And it was cool. He was like the third man. We were a 4-man band by the point. But I thought, and then I'm going to get to Nana because Nana was in many aspects, because I don't want anyone to get jealous, but Nana was like the reason why this worked. I will get to that later.
Oh, that's not true.
Come on, let me say it. The thing was, I believe that although we have people of color in the podcast, and most of us are not straight by the classical idea of that, we wanted to have more people. We wanted to have...
Yeah, we have one token straight.
Yeah. But the thing is, we didn't want to have like a podcast of only 4. Although I love the Glass Cannon, the first season, they were mostly like 5 dudes hanging out and talking. And I said, I don't want just that. And then I started asking, and someone said, hey, we have this person, Julia Morgan. Her nickname was Morgan, but Julia. And when we started talking, I felt like this is the perfect fit. This person is amazing, great role player, great storyteller, loves stories. I think it's the perfect fit for the party. However, none of us had a capacity of editing. By the time, Nana had been my friend for like more than 10 years, I guess. And they recently had moved back to Angra because they could not stay in Rio to finish their chef school, I would say like that. And I heard my friend saying, well, I'm studying editing video. And I said, hey, why don't you do that? Let's try editing audio. It's not that different. Come on. The thing is, you commented something about editing, and I said, hey, do you want to do this? It's going to be something small. No, I never said it was small. I was always honest. That's something I'm very serious about. But I said, Nana, we can't pay you yet, but I would like you being part of this project. Not only because you're one of my oldest friends, but because I trust you. And since the beginning, although, yes, what we do in the podcast while we record, while some of the storylines that I had to implement over the story were very good, and interpreting characters was something amazing, a lot has to be said about Nana's ability to tell the story, to enhance the story by the process of editing. This is why I say Nana is the reason why this works.
I try my best.
And your best is more than enough.
I really love editing, and I think I fell in love even more with editing because of the podcast, and because, like, I told you all this, like, I am kind of a hermit. I sometimes just disappear, but like when I was editing, it was almost like I was getting to know y'all better, and it was comforting, and that made me want to get better at what I was doing. I got faster, my process got faster. I used to edit at crazy hours sometimes. I'll be like editing at 4 a.m. like a lunatic because I can. I work from home. I can do whatever I want. It was so nice that you invited me, and that I got to know all these amazing people, like our friends. We became really good friends, and I appreciate that a lot. I also appreciate that all of you trusted me to do this job. The editing can make or break an episode. You can make the timing go wrong, and then you destroy the work people are doing. And I was very conscious of that, and I really tried my best to make sure that the episode was comfortable to listen to, that the podcast had the right pacing, and that it made everyone shine, because I wanted everyone to shine, because all of you are brilliant role players. It's not you are a brilliant DM. All of the others are brilliant role players. And Tormenta 20 is kind of a grueling game. Like, the battles are grueling, and the numbers are very inflated. The numbers get very high. I think there's a lot of space for everyone to shine. When I'm editing, I want to make sure that these moments are well represented so they can shine even more. I played as a guest for like 50 episodes. The way I left was jaw dropping. I don't know if I want to spoil if there's any Brazilian listening. Because it was,
Or Portuguese speakers in general. Don't skip on our podcast because you don't speak Brazilian Portuguese. It's a good podcast. It's a very nice place, cozy.
yeah. But the way I was out, oh my god, we couldn't speak for like 3 minutes straight. That had to be cut out. It was jaw dropping. It was amazing. But like, as a player playing this campaign, like we said, the numbers are very big. I was dealing like in a line that hit multiple people. I was dealing like almost 300 damage to everyone in the line. And we were level 14 or something.
So, not knowing anything about Tormenta, I just checked the Portuguese Wikipedia, but I didn't really understand it. So it's a fantasy setting?
Yes.
And the campaigns you play, are there any like Brazilian cultural elements in them?
That's the one thing that I love about this system. Although it is a fantasy setting, medieval, castles, etc., there is a thing. It's funny because you can feel the difference between a fantasy setting written by Brazilian people and one written by people from the United States, written from people in Europe. There is a difference in, I'd say, it's a slight shift from the point of view, because you do have knights and you do have castles and you do have clerics. However, the identity, the things that you see, you feel. One thing that I like to say whenever I'm thinking about it is when I see many RPGs that are written or settings that are written in the US, many cities have names that make sense. Like, okay, this is Neverwinter or Sunless Citadel, which is one of my favorite low-level adventures from D&D, Oakhurst. It makes sense. It is a name that has a meaning. Funny enough, here in Brazil, many cities, although they have names that have meanings, they don't necessarily have meanings in Portuguese because they are from our original people's languages and they are inspired by other languages of the people who migrated to Brazil. So if you don't understand the name of a city, it is something normal in Brazil. And then you research like, okay, why this city called this? What does the name of my city means? It's such a small detail. Like, okay, city names not necessarily have a meaning or the name is not obvious in their meaning. And whenever I read Tormenta, the setting, not only talking about the RPG, because it is a setting, there are, I think, more than 10 books, novels, I would say, like romances in the setting, written by Brazilian authors.
And they're big. They're thick books, thick books.
So the thing for me, I think, if you look at pictures of the setting and you read the book, not knowing it, I will say this not as a demerit to Pathfinder, because I love Pathfinder. I have a very loving relationship. But Pathfinder is a fantasy setting that is, if you think about it, very similar to settings we have in it was at the beginning a setting for D&D. It had adventure books written for Dungeons and Dragons. Now, you take that and you look at Tormenta, it is different. If I'm not mistaken, if you're interested in ever looking, there is a module for Roll20 with an adventure and I think a starter kit translated to English. I don't remember if it's still available. It used to be available on Roll20. It's like an adventure and it has a little bit of the system. It's an interesting read if you can find it. And we also have a friend of the pod, Victor Lucky, that lives in Canada. He has made streams in English of the RPG. So it is one of those things that if you say, okay, is it Brazilian? Nowadays, and it's interesting that you asked me if there are really Brazilian things in the setting. In the past, it had less. It was more like it has this aura. It's like you know it's Brazilian because you are Brazilian and you understand the way we think. But nowadays, I would say that some elements, like there was a savanna in the north of the continent that was simply like the Great Savannah. The Great Savannah was like just like a place that existed and it was not very explored. However, recently in the atlas of the setting, they changed it. They create a culture that has a lot of Afrofuturistic characteristics. If you were to think about it, it's a different type of fantasy than medieval standard thing, but it's so great. It's so amazing.
It's also so reminds me a lot of like undiscovered native tribes, because there's a lot of natives that we don't know because the world is big. There are untouched forests in a lot of places, and there are entire populations that we don't know of. And that is very common in Brazil because we have the Amazon forest, and the Amazon forest is gigantic. So every now and then we discover people there, and then we have to try and make contact and try to help them with vaccines. A lot of them don't want to be meddled with, so they leave them be. Some want are interested in the help. It's a complex thing, and I think the inclusion of that is very Brazilian thing.
So, speaking of the different ethnic groups in Brazil, how's the representation there? And I've heard there are a couple of Afro-Brazilian role-playing games. Is it kind of mixed in the gaming scene, or how does that look like?
We have Afrofuturistic games. We have like more current games that are based in like Ubanda and other Afro religions. The last convention we went, I just bought my boyfriend a series of books. It's an RPG about Ubanda, which is his religion, which is an Afro-Brazilian religion. And there was also a research book, like of the book with the whole research they done to make the RPG. And I think there was like a setting book and a book to educate people about Ubanda. And I bought all of them and I was like, yeah, my boyfriend will like this. So I immediately bought it, and then I was like, here, this is yours. Keep it, love it. He's studying game design, and he is a part of a group called Melanina RPG, which is a group for people of color, especially Black people, but people of color, to get together, make RPGs, promote each other. So we have movements like that, which is very nice. And yeah, we have a lot of like Afrofuturistic things, more contemporary things. There are plenty of games if you want to get into the scene.
And even in settings like Tormenta itself, it used to be more bland in the characterization of groups of people. However, the presence of black people, of people of color in Tormenta, it has been there for a long time. Like, you can say many things about like, oh, there could be more, but one of the main heroes in this world, one of the biggest knights in this world, is a black man. It's like there are many illustrations. He's a knight and high priest of the god of justice in this world. And he's a black man. And also, as I said, that Great Savannah, now called Ubani, is a setting that is inspired in Brazilian African fantasy. And it has been having this care about representing that much more. So I think that there's that, but it is incomparable to the indie scene of RPG in Brazil. It's amazing. People produce such things. Nana said perfectly. I cannot add to that.
We've talked for more than 40 minutes and I'm out of questions and it's 2 in the morning. Is there anything you want to add before I stop the recording?
Just play new games. Even though sometimes there's a language barrier, you can find ways to get over that and play games. Play different games, even if it's just in your language. Experiments. I mean, I love Dungeons and Dragons, but there's more in this world than Dungeons and Dragons. And there are lots of good games out there. Experiment, play, have fun, find different things. Just explore. Explore, and you see that there are so many things waiting for you, and you'll be so happy. That's it.
If I can leave piece of advice here for people, is allow yourselves to make mistakes. Be not only kind to yourself, but open to your group. We have lived in this world in which, like, the game master, the dungeon master is like, no, I'm perfect. I crafted this story and I will show you how great my. You make mistakes. Everyone does. Your group is ideally made up of your friends. Be honest, be vulnerable. I believe in that. Being vulnerable, telling people, like, okay, so what do you think of this idea? Listen to your players' ideas. Listen, get inspired. Nana said the thing about play other RPGs, play other games. Play whatever you can get your hands into, because this is how inspiration is born. By immersing yourself in different things, you will see something and say, hey, that's not inspiring for an RPG. And then one day you look at that idea again and say, no, wait, this is the perfect plot for that story, or this is the perfect moment I want to recreate. So allow yourself to make mistakes and allow yourself to experience new things. If I'm leaving something like a takeaway, is this.
Honestly, making mistakes sometimes brings you to wonderful things. Some mistakes exist to better the story and make it more fun and more interesting. Because if you only win, there's no stakes. And games are better when there's stakes.
I couldn't resist the idea of winning in an RPG, the idea of win, and then what you do after that, I win harder. Like, come on, let's enjoy it. Let's sometimes just have tea around the table, talking about, like, how cute the bad guy looks. It's fun.
Yeah, it's so fun.
I said the thing about making mistakes because it's about having fun. We sometimes forget, we lose track of that, of being fun to the stuff. We're playing RPGs not because we have to. We're playing RPGs because they're cool.
We play because it's fun and because we have friends that we want to play with. And that's the most important thing. And also, if you're playing with strangers, if you don't become friends, you don't have to stay in the group. You can leave. Leave and find people who are willing to be your friend.
Find your people.
And now we talk with someone who has been in the role-playing scene for a long time and can tell us a bit about the history of role-playing games in Brazil in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s.
Hi, everybody. My name is Fred Furtado. I'm a writer and science communicator from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So my story with role-playing games is actually kind of mixed with the story of role-playing games in Brazil. The first people who got to know the game were in the early 80s. For some reason, they had access to books from the United States. Maybe their parents would travel and then they would bring, and they would talk about these books with their friends in school. So that was about, I think, 82. Oh, by the way, a disclaimer. So this is the story of our experience in Rio, but Brazil is a very big country, and I'm not sure the story I tell here will correlate with the experience of other people in other regions, because in the early 80s was really tough to get the original books here in Rio, and Rio is like a well-developed hub here in Brazil, Rio, São Paulo. So I'm not sure if someone in Manaus, which is the capital of Amazonas, in the north, or people in Cuiabá in the central western portion, at that time, I think if it was a tough time for us, it would be really hard for them to get the books as well. So bear in mind when I'm telling the story that might not be the same for everybody. So these people would play with their friends during the 80s, and then their friends would call other people to play, and that's how the game started to spread in the community. Actually, my first contact was in 1985. A friend of a friend in school told me about this game that was really popular in the US, and I had never heard of it. and he gave me a photocopy of the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook. I'll come back to photocopies because they are a very, very significant part of that time for role-playing games in Brazil. I think I read the photocopy a bit, but it really didn't click for me. I read it and then I put it away and then didn't do anything. And after about a year, he asked for the photocopy back because he realized I wasn't going to do anything with it. So 2 years later, I entered university. And about July 1987, one of my friends comes up to me and said, "Oh, let's go to the library. I want to talk to you about something." I said, "Oh, sure, okay." And so he starts talking about, there is this game which is based on the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, which I didn't know by then. I had no idea about Lord of the Rings or anything. Although I was a science fiction reader, my science fiction knowledge was John Wyndham and the classics like Jules Verne and other works like by Bram Stoker, like Dracula, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. He started to explain the game to me, and I had the reaction I think many people have to role-playing games. And I said, "Okay, but how do you win the game?" He said, "No, there's no winning. You just live like your character." And I said, "Yeah, but how do you stuff? Is there like cards or anything?" "No, there's this special dice." And then he explained to me everything, and he said, "Let's make a character for you, and then we can play." I said, "Okay." So I chose a magic user. It was AD&D that we were going to play. And then other friends of ours from our class were invited as well. I think the first table was me, Paulino Soares, Marcel Montanheiro, and João Amarante. And the master, the guy who invited us, was Flávio Lobo. So we got together one Saturday afternoon, and we started playing the British adventure Eye of the Serpent. And it was a game changer for me. Later that night, we had a party with, I think was the birthday of a friend in our college class. And one of our friends asked me, "How was the game?" And I turned to her and very dramatically I said, "It's the game I've been waiting for all my life." And that was it. My friends also were very impacted by it. And so we started playing. And then Flávio Lobo, which was from this earlier group who had learned about the game years before, he also had other friends. And then he introduced us. And then the group increased. At the end of 1987, I switched universities because I wanted to study genetics. And the course at the original university wasn't really that good. So I changed it to the Federal University. And then I introduced my new friends at the new university to role-playing games. And then the size of the group increased again. It was a common experience by then because we didn't have social media or instant messaging. So it was more like a networking thing. "Oh, I know this guy who plays." Or then you invited a friend who didn't play. And we did a lot of that by then. We started with AD&D, but then we went to everything that would come out, would play. So Shadowrun, Space 1889, Traveler, Paranoia, all the games that were coming out at the time, we would play. So what happened? As I said, it was very difficult to get the books. So someone would get a book and then it would be photocopied and distributed among everybody. By 1987, there was a São Paulo comic book store called Devir, which was founded, and they imported the books. So it became a bit easier to get them. We didn't depend on someone traveling abroad. And here in Rio, we had a newsstand called Banca do Osni. Osni was the name of the guy who owned the newsstand. And later they opened a comic book store as well and did the same thing. They brought the books so you could buy the original books without having to travel abroad. So what would happen is that gradually the photocopies were exchanged for the original books, and then everybody would chip in, buy the books, and then the books would stay with whoever was going to run the adventure. And eventually everybody started having jobs or doing internships with a scholarship. So we had some more money, we could afford the books. And that went all the way to the end of the 80s. And then by the 90s, that's when the role-playing games really exploded in Brazil. And then you had the first Brazilian RPGs, which were written by my friends. So in 1991, Devir, that bookstore I mentioned, translated the licensed Steve Jackson's GURPS, and they published a Portuguese edition. Then, by the end of the year, 1991, my friends Igor Moraes, Júlio Augusto, Leonardo Naum, and Marcelo Rodrigues, they wrote Tagmar, which was the first role-playing game produced in Brazil. It was a heroic fantasy RPG based on Tolkien. It had a few innovations, like they used a resolution table, kind of like TSR's Marvel Superheroes. And that's a funny story as well. Remember how I said that photocopies were like the big thing? So one day, Igor was promoting Tagmar in an event or something, and a kid comes up to him and says, are you guys going to release the resolution table by itself? And Igor replied, no, I don't plan to do that. Why? Oh, no, because I photocopied the book, but the resolution table is not very good in black and white, so I wanted to get the color version. And then, okay, so Tagmar was produced. Igor opened a publisher called GSA, and that's the main publisher for role-playing games in Brazil for a while. So the next year, we have the first role-playing game in Brazil that uses Brazilian culture, which was called Desafio dos Bandeirantes. We'll translate as Challenge of the Trailblazers. Although today we know the Bandeirantes were really like bad people. They were conducting these enslavement expeditions. So they would go inside the country and then capture native Brazilians and force them to work in farms and stuff like that. So Desafio dos Bandeirantes was by Carlos Klimic, Luiz Eduardo Riccone, and Flávio Andrade. Then by 1993, we played a lot of Vampire because Vampire was released in 1991. And then we got the books, we bought all the books, but then Devir also got the license, and I think they started publishing it in Portuguese as well. But people from my generation, we would usually play the games from the original books because we knew English, and since we started playing the game with those books, we didn't really use the Brazilian editions. We went straight to the original ones. So what happens is that we played a lot of Vampire, and we found out that Mark Heinhagen was coming to Brazil in 1993 to promote the games because Devir had signed a licensing agreement with them, with White Wolf. So myself and Paulino, we decided to write a proposal for a Rio by Night supplement. So by that time, White Wolf would produce supplements for different cities for Vampire, but there was none for South America. So it's let's write a supplement for that. So we wrote a 13-page proposal, and we realized Heinhagen would be at a comic book store here in Rio to sign copies of the game. So we showed up there, and then we gave him the proposal and said, hey, by the way, we wrote this proposal for Rio by Night. What do you think? And he was very gracious. He accepted it. He said he was going to read. And he said, well, I'm going to read. I'm going to be in São Paulo next week, because by then Devir was producing the first international RPG meeting in Brazil. In Portuguese, we call it Encontro Internacional de RPG. It was the first one. There were several annual editions, but that was the first one. So we went back there, went to São Paulo in 1993. We met him. He said he liked the proposal. He gave some advice, and then we sat with Devir, which was, again, the licensee, the project to write Rio by Night. So we got Devir brought in Carlos Patati, which was a comic book writer, and Tadeusz Blanchett, which was an American who worked with them, an American writer. And we started the project, but eventually it got discontinued. I think they used some of our ideas, which was that Rio was a free city in the world for the World of Darkness second edition. But what we did, we released everything we wrote. It's on my site, so if you want to go there and download, it's freely available.
So I'm always interested in these localizations of games set in the real world, like Shadowrun, well, it's in the future of the real world, but or Vampire. So what would be specific to Rio by Night compared to American books?
So what we wanted is we saw Rio as this place that was a kind of neutral ground for all the clans. So you would come to Rio to party if you were a vampire. So to have access, especially during Carnival. So the idea is that you could come here and nobody could do anything to you. Like you leave your quarrels, your clan wars, your sect disputes outside. You come to Rio, everything will work fine. You can drink blood, you can have a great time. Nothing bad will happen to you. So that was the big selling point for Rio. And then in our proposal, we tried to connect all the other splats. So we had the werewolves, we had the fae. I think Mark Hagen told us to try to concentrate more on vampires. We had a Methuselah in Rio that was sleeping under the mountain. So basically, we tried to do that. And then we also proposed a new bloodline called Ageolo, which were vampires that were enmeshed with the Afro-Brazilian religions. And by then, Rio during the 90s had like a really big problem with criminal activity and violence. So that also came into the proposal. We tried to reflect that there. Not that Rio today doesn't have a criminal problem, but it was a really like visceral thing back then. So we tried to put that in the book as well.
And then what happened after the 90s in Brazil?
By 1994, dedicated magazines started appearing, like Dragão Brasil, which would be Dragon Brazil, but they weren't a licensee of Dragon magazine. Dragão Dourado, Golden Dragon, Black Lotus. Certain big publishers in Brazil started investing in role-playing games, like Edioro, which was a big publisher back then, released Riddle Quest, which was a board game based on role-playing games. Arthur Vecchi created a publisher called Nova Vecchi, and he released a Brazilian RPG called Monsters, which had a humorous take. It was like a toon somewhere. There were also Devir brought in macho women with guns, which here in Brazil was Mulheres Machonas Armadas até os Dentes. And then by 95, you had First Quest, which was a simplified version of a D&D second edition. You have Millennia, which is the first Brazilian sci-fi RPG, which was written by Paulo Vicente, and Igor, who was one of the authors of Tagmar. Devir brought Magic the Gathering, which was a big thing here. And then you have some other Brazilian games like Arcanum, Defensores de Tóquio, Tokyo Defenders. Shadowrun got published in Portuguese. Then you had like adventure games, but taking role-playing games into educational space to be used for pedagogical approaches. By 1998, we proposed a supplement for Shadowrun, which would be called Paranormal Animals of South America, me and Paulino again. We did a proposal, we sent to Michael Movehill by snail mail, but we never got a response. And again, I put it all on my website to check it out. By 1999, they translated GURPS Lite, which they called mini GURPS, and they released a bunch of scenarios based on Brazilian history, which were written again by Luiz Eduardo Ricon from Desafio dos Bandeirantes. And then by 2001, we had our case of moral panic, satanic panic, because there was a murder in Ouro Preto, which is a city in the state of Minas Gerais. A young woman was stabbed 17 times and left in a cemetery. And when the police investigated the crime, they locked on to a role-playing game thing. They thought the students had murdered her because they were playing a role-playing game like Vampire, and she had lost the game, so they killed her. And it was a big thing, and then the press really did a number on that. By the end, like 8 years later, they were finally tried and were acquitted because there was no evidence for that, and it was a mess, really bad. And then by the 2000s, I didn't really follow all that close, but then you had new publishers like Jambô, and you had specific sites like Rede RPG, which started organizing events and had news about role-playing games, and other games were being developed in Portuguese as well. But then there was it wasn't quite as vibrant as the 90s. But I think it picked up after 2010s because then you had Dungeons and Dragons making a comeback. It became easier to produce as well with all the tools you have now for writing, for illustrating. And so we have a lot of Brazilians doing role-playing games. I think we have a very strong presence with the old school Renaissance movement. So you have a lot of artists working there. But yeah, I think it diversified a lot in the 21st century.
Yes, and for the listeners, if you also want to read up on this history and like read the names of the games and authors again, there's actually an academic article about this called Analog Role-Playing Game Studies, a Brazilian Overview. And I'm going to butcher the names, Tadeu Rodrigues Iuama and Luis Falsao, from 2022 in the International Journal of Role-Playing. It also has an overview of the history. My question was, like, in the 90s, were there any Brazilian-made games that were very popular compared to imported games that might have were second place to D&D or something like that, or were they always smaller?
Tagmar was really popular, the first Brazilian RPG. So much so that in the 21st century, the authors decided to release it as an open license game. The community got it and created a second version, which they call Tagmar 2.0. And then recently there was the Tagmar 3, the third iteration of the rules. And there is a website and they have a very active community. They have produced a lot of supplements for it. Also, in the 90s, there was a game called Defensores de Tóquio, which I mentioned, Tokyo Defenders, which had a second and third versions. I never played it because, again, we were more focused on the regional games, although we did play Tagmar because our friends had written it, and Desafio dos Bandeirantes and Millennia. But Defenders of Tóquio, I think, got a lot of traction as well. A lot of people played them. And there was a fantasy scenario called Torment, that also has a lot of fans. They started as a scenario in one of the magazines I mentioned, Dragão Dourado, or Dragão Brasil, I'm not sure. And then it went to another publisher, and I think now it's with Jambô, which is a big publisher from the south of Brazil, which they now release Brazilian versions of several games like Mutants and Masterminds, 7C, and also Tormenta. I think Tagmar was really popular, but I can't tell you exactly because AD&D was like a gateway game here. So we started with AD&D and then you moved to other games. So I'm not sure I could say it was as popular or more popular. Tagmar was the first one and people wanted it. Was in Portuguese, so you could then reach everybody who couldn't speak English. And it was heroic fantasy, so it was similar to D&D in theme, at least. So yeah, I would put these games as the popular ones.
What kind of settings did they have?
Tagmar was heroic fantasy, like with different nations, and you could be a human, an elf, a dwarf, like Tolkienist fantasy. As I said, Tokyo Defenders was a bit of a play with tokusatsu shows, all those shows from Japanese media like Ultraman and Super Sentai, like Changeman or Jaspion, all these games. So it started like this. I think they expanded a bit to superheroes and stuff because they have some rules for superpowers. And Tormenta is also a fantasy game. So aside from Millennia, back then, I don't think we have like a strong sci-fi scene in role-playing games, mostly fantasy and stuff like that. You're talking about studying the history. So Eliane Betocchi was an illustrator here, and she did art for most of the games, like Tagmar. But then she became a researcher in role-playing games. She's now in Ohio, the university, doing work there. And she married Carlos Klimicki, who was one of the authors of Desafio dos Bandeirantes. And they together, at the end of the 90s, they published a game called Era do Caos, Age of Chaos. And later they created, it's a role-playing game, it's also a tool for you to use in your games called Carnais, the tool they created. And they are really into this part of research. And Carlos Klimicki especially is in part of the educational use of role-playing games, which was something that also flourished here. And recently, I think last year, they had the 50th edition of a meeting, it was online, about the use of role-playing games in education.
And more recently, you've been more into superhero topics, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of superhero comics. And what I did is that one of the games that we played, actually two of the games we played a lot in the 90s, was Marvel Superheroes from TSR and DC Heroes from Mayfair. We played a lot. And I wouldn't say I'm the forever GM, but I was plenty GM. For superhero games, I run a lot of games. I always had more ideas than I had time to play or to run. So in 2010, Shannon Appelkline, who was then the editor-in-chief of RPGNet, he asked for column ideas from the users. And I said, oh, okay, I have all these ideas for superhero games. I think I can write a column. I thought I would have 10 ideas, 10 columns. So I pitched him. It would be called Super Seeds. And I would talk about campaigns or adventures or characters, not necessarily superhero games, but super games. It would be superhero, people with powers, fantasy supers, sci-fi supers. He said, okay. And I started writing. But then as I was writing the column, more ideas would come. So to cut the long story short, I'm now on installment 172. So I've been writing since 2010. And I did the first 130 on RPGNet. They're still there if people want to read them. But then I wanted to produce like PDFs about the content I was creating. So I need money. And then I said, oh, maybe I should start a crowdfunding site, Patreon. So I moved the column there. And for a while, they would both appear. First on Patreon, then 1 month later on RPGNet. And I finally concentrated them on Patreon. So people can subscribe. And then every month I have a column, which can be a character, can be a setting, can be an adventure. And then in between, sometimes I have also extra content, like an adaptation for a specific system or something that wasn't included in the original seed for a specific setting, but I think it would be an interesting element. And it's been good. I have some PDFs on Drive-Thru RPG, and I still have a lot of ideas, so I think the column will still go on for a few years, which for me is a surprise because I said I only thought I would have material for 10 columns, and now it's been 15 years later and it's still going.
Is there anything you want to add before I stop the recording?
Role-playing games are really good thing. I really like them, and they were and they are a big thing in Brazil. And I urge people to try them because it's a really fun way to spend time. And I remember one of my college friends who didn't play, he once said to me, oh, I envy you because of this role-playing game thing. You still keep in touch with all our friends, and I only when we have something like a birthday or anything like that. And also give here a shout out to RPGNet, which is a great site. And I think everybody who's interested in role-playing games and speaks English, of course, should go there, visit, and sign up because it's a really nice place. It's very inclusive, and there's a lot of great people there to talk about the game. That's it.
So thank you for listening to The World of RPGs, episode 24, part 1. And I just published episode part 2 right away. So don't hang up and just listen to the second part.